The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.
While families prepare for this holiday weekend, there are plenty of single people who would like nothing more than to find the love of their lives or simply meet someone new. But dating in a pandemic is a whole new ballgame. Tonight we'll find out why some old-fashioned ways may be making a comeback. Then our Ontario Hubs introduce us to the author of a new storybook that helps kids understand this COVID-19 situation. And from Canada's stance towards China to the small businesses of the hidden office economy, we've got the Agenda's Week in Review. It's Friday, October 9th. I'm Nam Kiwanuka, and that's all ahead on the agenda. A mask and a bottle of sanitizer isn't exactly the look most people want on a first date. But for those seeking love or companionship as this pandemic drags on, it's also increasingly clear that if you're single, you can't just wait it out. Where does that leave people, and what does dating in the time of COVID look like? Let's find out from Summerland, BC, Marianne Fisher, professor of psychology at St. Mary's University in Halifax, and here in Ontario's capital city in the Lakeview neighborhood, Natasha Sharma, relationship expert at NKS Therapy and co-founder of the online mental health education course, The 8-Hour Therapist. And in North York, Rebecca Liang, a graduate student at Ryerson University who has been dating in this very unusual time. Welcome to you all. Happy to have you here on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Marianne, I'm going to start with you because I think there are people watching this and thinking, you know, we are in a pandemic. Why would you date in a pandemic? Stay home, stay safe. Why do you think it's important for us to have this conversation?
We're a social species and we don't want to be alone. And the reality is that when we're scared or when things are uncertain, we want to be with other people. And I think that the pandemic is really showing us that being home alone all the time is not healthy for us. So, you know, pandemic or no pandemic, we can't change who we are fundamentally in terms of wanting to be with others and wanting to attach and be close and form those highly companionship relationships. So it might not be ideal from a public health point of view, but we're human.
Well, you're actually conducting a nationwide survey on how the pandemic is affecting dating. What are you trying to find out from Canadians in this survey?
Right. So I think it's a fun survey because I'm in the really luxurious spot of being someone who has studied dating and mating and sexuality for a number of years now. So half of the survey deals with things like, what do you think your dating value is in the local mating market? Or what sorts of things do you consider in terms of forming sexual relationships? What kind of relationship are you actually seeking? Or relationships, plural, you never know. And I've been looking at individual assessments. The other half of the survey, though, is dealing specifically with the pandemic. So it's things like during lockdown, did you try to improve yourself in some way? Did you try to pick up some new skills or not? And what sort of things do you think your mating rivals have been doing? So basically, it's this idea of, do you think the playing field has been fair? So while you've been locked down and doing all the quarantining and everything, do you think someone else is going after those potential mates that you may be interested in? And it's been very interesting to do this work so far.
So what have you found so far? What have you found the impact of the pandemic on dating? What's it been?
Yeah, so we're trying not to dive too deep into the data because it's still open. We're kind of, to be honest, it sounds a bit pessimistic, but we're waiting to see how the second wave impacts on dating. And we want to see how longitudinally that carries out. But what I can tell you so far, there's two real significant things to share. One is that when you ask Canadians, what skills have you picked up on a sex and dating survey? As a researcher, you rather expect a little bit of relationship stuff in terms of, you know, I enhanced my body, I worked out, things like that. And it's not. It's actually much bigger. And the two that were most significant in terms of skills, Canadians said that they improved their communication skills and they've improved their problem solving. And I was really impressed by that. That was something I hadn't really considered. The other thing that we found was a general shift from people wanting basically an opportunistic approach to dating. So if the right person comes along, yeah, I might have a long-term relationship, but otherwise it's just going to be short-term hookups. We've gone from that to people seeking companions, to seeking long-term, and wanting to have that deeper, more meaningful type of relationship. And that's really important to us as social psychologists.
And Natasha, just to pick up on what Marianne said, do you think that the pandemic is taking us back to the days of courtship?
I don't know what it might be taking us back to, but it seems to be taking us forward. Definitely, I agree that there is a trend towards people who are focusing more on what's meaningful. And a situation like this, which is unprecedented, does tend to get us cognitively focusing on what's most important, whether we're directly aware of that or not. And so there is an increasing trend towards dating and finding partners with intention, and less of a focus on more casual types of interactions. And I think that's certainly influenced by 2020 and all that has come with making the adjustments that we have. This type of event has really kicked us back into understanding what is deeply important at the end of the day, like when everything is said and done. And we know, as experts in psychology, we know that meaningful, deep connections are strongly correlated with our mental health and our well-being and our sense of happiness.
Well, you said a word I want to pick up on. You said intention. Do you think that maybe this pandemic is changing? Do you think that if, in the after times, I don't want to speak too soon, but in the after times, it will actually have like a long-term positive effect or negative effect?
Potentially. I mean, it could have a long-term effect, especially because it's lasting quite a significant period of time. We aren't going to make any changes from the way we're living anytime soon. I think we're in this for at least another year or two, maybe more. And because of the duration of time that we're all being asked to make significant adjustments to our lives and sort of have that overlying mentality of focusing on what's important and understanding, what's meaningful to you and what really brings value to you in your life at the end of the day, that actually could have a very lasting effect, because it's going to be a long period in all of our stories at the end of the day.
And Rebecca, at the beginning of the conversation, I mentioned that you have been dating during this. How did the pandemic change things for you?
Oh, well, for me, I think it definitely put a really large emphasis on communication, especially online now, because I personally don't really like to go out and meet people during these times. I just don't think it's the safest thing to do. But that also comes with its own set of difficulties. For example, I believe that conversation flows a lot better in person because there is that back and forth in real time. But once you switch on to online communication, you can walk away from your phone. You can choose to ignore messages. Sometimes when you're speaking online, things can get misinterpreted. So definitely navigating online communication in terms of building a meaningful connection has been a learning curve.
Say you were to go out and meet somebody during this, what would you need to consider to keep yourself safe?
The first thing I would consider is location. So personally, anything outside. Anything within enclosed spaces just seems a little bit risky to me, and that's just a no-go. And possibly just social distancing, but I wouldn't say 6 feet apart because that seems a little bit unrealistic when you're out on a date. But I guess just keeping the guidelines in mind. You're sanitizing your hands, you're wearing a mask in public places.
Natasha, during this pandemic, you would think that the support of your community is more important, but we can't do that. We can't just hang out with our friends and pass the days together. Do you think that in a pandemic, it has made finding a partner that much more important?
I do, either at a very conscious and intentional level or on a maybe a deeper subconscious level, I do think people are focusing more on, because when we're without something, it of course shines a spotlight on just how meaningful it actually is in our lives. And so I do, some research has actually shown that 6 out of 10 people actually are comfortable with meeting people online. And certainly, I'm sure that I haven't seen the data on whether there's been a surge in video dating versus just texting and sort of messaging, but I'm sure that's the case. And I think people are becoming more open and maybe a less cynical. I think my experience has been prior to the pandemic that when it comes to finding companionship online, or just finding companionship long term, a more meaningful connection, there's been almost a little bit of a negative or cynical view. And I think that this has created a more, if not more positive or optimistic view, at least less bitter, and I think more openness and more hopefulness around the possibility of forming a lasting connection in some way.
Would you even say that it's created a lifeline? Because if we didn't have online dating options, people might be more reckless to meet in person?
Potentially. I agree with what Marianne said. We have a very strong drive. As humans, we have a very strong drive to and desire to connect with other people and to form relationships and attachments. So yeah, I think in a lot of ways, technology has been a very good thing in that regard, because it gives us an option. It gives us a medium to do this safely. It gives us an option to establish some form of connection. I still do believe in-person connection is sort of the gold standard, and eventually, but this is definitely a way to do things safely and to still have this quality aspect of your life and not have to give it up entirely.
Rebecca, I don't really want to get into your business, but I have to ask, has the pandemic made it more important for you to find a partner?
Personally, no. My, I guess, motivation has stayed the same level as pre-pandemic. I think just method of communication and how forming that meaningful connection, that has changed.
And Marianne, we're entering what the kids, I can't believe I'm going to say this on the agenda, what the kids called cuffing season. Is there any indication that people's interest in companionship is a shift in life priorities, or just a means to get through what could potentially be a very long and lonely winter ahead?
That's a great question, and honestly, I don't think we have the data to tell us that. But what I can say is that the online dating companies are reporting what they call an extended cuffing season in place. So their busy time of year tends to be starting up around Labor Day, and it carries through until late February, and especially Boxing Day till about Valentine's Day. That tends to be the prime cuffing season. And they're reporting right now that rates in the early September, even July, going back as far as July, were on par with February for number of messages, number of people signing up for memberships, revenue generation. And who knows whether this is going to be a long-lasting impact in terms of what people want or not. But I do think it's important to recognize that people are shifting in what they're willing to do. So, for example, many online dating companies are reporting that their clients are more open and flexible about what kind of relationship they're looking for, or they've loosened the restrictions about their preferences, so what they want in a mate. And just to echo what was mentioned earlier, they're also reporting about 10% a year ago would say, yes, I would like a one-on-one video chat feature in a dating app. That's up to over 70%. So there is a huge change in how technology is impacting meeting potential mates. And I think that in itself is really going to have some interesting ramifications down the road.
I think it's really interesting what you just said about maybe a year ago, people might want 10 things on the list, but then now that may take 5 things on the list. What is that suggesting to us?
For me, and based on the research background I have, what that says to me is that people are less likely to go, okay, the one I want to be with has these idealized qualities. I think people are being much more realistic about what those core fundamental things are that they actually need in a long-term lasting relationship. And I think it's not so much a settling as a really deeper insight into what a relationship means to them and what they would like to have in their life, especially if there's a second wave, right? Like that's the big concern that a lot of daters are saying is they want to make sure that they're with somebody in a good relationship and that they really don't want to be locked down in a bad one. So I think it's really just this insightful, retrospective view of potential mates.
And maybe what's important considering what we're dealing with. I want to read you something from a 2015 article in Vanity Fair, and it was called Tinder and the Dawn of the Dating Apocalypse. I don't know if they were talking about the pandemic, but there you have it. The comparison to online shopping seems an apt one. Dating apps are the free market economy come to sex. The innovation of Tinder was a swipe, the flick of a finger on a picture, no more elaborate profiles necessary, and no more fear of rejection. Users only know whether they've been approved, never when they've been discarded. It's telling that swiping has become jocularly incorporated into advertisements for various products, a nod to the notion that online, the act of choosing consumer brands and sex partners has become interchangeable. Natasha, there have been a lot of criticisms that online dating has ruined intimacy and created a meaningless so-called hookup culture where people are easily replaceable. Now your only option in this pandemic, as we mentioned before, is to date online. How have these apps ultimately helped us or hurt us?
I think it depends. There are certain, because not every app is created in the same way, and they're not really speaking to or geared towards the same type of consumer either. So I think Tinder, and speaking specifically to Tinder, I think it was created for a very specific group or type of person who is looking more for that casual sort of hookup or a relationship that isn't necessarily going to be long-term or a dating type of relationship. But addressing that idea of rejection, yeah, I think that the online dating scene does pose the opportunity for a lot of rejection. It's more, you're doing things with more quantity, more frequency, and it's the opportunity exists to be rejected on a more regular or frequent basis. On the other hand, you have it presents a medium to meet people. And as I said, there are different apps which you can use depending on what you're looking for. So there are those that are catering to and market themselves as apps that are for people who want to look for partnership, marriage, long-term relationships, whereas Tinder has been more stereotypically a hookup app. So I don't know that the apps themselves have necessarily created that shift. I actually think it was more a shift that was happening long before the apps were created and more a product of how we've changed as a culture over the past 25 to 50 some odd years that has really led up to a much more diversified and liberal approach to how we want our relationships to look.
And Rebecca, I want to ask you the same question. Do you think that online dating apps have hurt us or helped us?
I think a little bit of both. I think it's helped us, communicate with a wide range of people. I personally believe that it's cool to keep your options open instead of just limiting yourself to a small circle. But it's also hurt us in the sense that it's hard to know what the other person is looking for when you're only speaking, online. And sometimes online conversations can be very scratch the surface, a little bit shallow. You don't really get into more of the deep stuff so soon. So it's harder to know if you're on the same page with somebody.
Body language is very important. And Marianne, based on the literature out there, how does the relationship that started online compare to one that was sparked from an in-person interaction?
So that's a hard question to answer, only because it's sort of like an apples and oranges issue. Online dating has really picked up in popularity. And so if I say something about how long-term relationships are, do you mean 2 years, 10 years, 20 years down the road, right? But what I can say is that it's definitely a more popular way to meet someone for a long-term relationship. And it's increasing in its popularity, especially among older age groups. So it's something that I think a lot of people over 40 have been slowly gravitating towards over time. And we're seeing that trickling up now through the older age categories as well to a significant degree. But what I will say is that I'm an evolutionary psychologist, so I come from the background that these apps are created in a reflection of what we want, and that they didn't create what we want. They are being used by consumers who have a need and want to use them. And I think in terms of the long-term effects of meeting online, it's not really going to be much different, perhaps, than meeting someone in real life, because we still are the same people in many ways. We just are a little bit different in terms of our technology or our ability to ghost and those sorts of features. But I think fundamentally, we still want the same sorts of things, whether we meet someone next door or whether we meet someone online. And I think the pandemic has really highlighted what we said earlier, what we really want and need in a relationship.
And Natasha, I'd like to ask you the same question.
I agree. The market is there to respond to what humans want and how we have changed. And we have certainly changed substantially, and the world around us responds. So the online world and having that as an option is, I think, certainly going to grow, projected to only grow, and but it doesn't replace the options that existed before it. It just adds a new dimension to where we're at in this moment in history and what people want. And we've stayed more the same, even though I said we've changed quite a bit. I actually think fundamentally we've stayed more the same in terms of what we want as human beings, our basic needs. Love, connection, to belong, to be worthy, to feel worthy, to have people witness our lived experience. If we ask ourselves sort of in our older years and at the end of life, we want that sort of witness to our experience, to our existence. And that I don't think will ever change unless one day we turn into robots.
I'm getting all emotional listening to you because that's really what it is. People are looking for a connection. And Rebecca, I just wanted to ask you what you thought about what I just asked them both.
I agree with what they said. I think, especially during this time, during a pandemic, I think dating apps has really helped. You feel connected to people, even though you're not there in person. And I think that's really important, especially when you're kind of holed up alone, like in whatever location that you are. So wanting to feel, loved and needed and, wanting to belong, that's what makes us human. And I think dating apps has definitely helped us with feeling more connected with other people, even though you're not physically together.
Okay. And Natasha, I just want to ask you quickly, because I know a few of my friends are in long distance relationships where their partner is in the US, and because the border is shut, people can't cross the border. What's it been like for people who are dealing with long distance relationships, but they can't see each other?
I think it's certainly difficult. I mean, again, it's very human to miss someone you love. I mean, you feel that sense of the void, the longing. Those are very natural, very human emotions. I would just encourage those people to play the mental long game here. There will come a time, no one will keep you apart forever and forever. I mean, if your relationship is that serious, there will come a moment where you can come together again, either to visit or to relocate permanently somewhere if your relationship is that serious. And I would use it as an opportunity to really try and put a different spin on it. I actually had a situation like that, not that the border was closed, but my husband, I lived in the States and my husband lived here, and we were apart for 2 years. And that was 6 months after we met. I moved to the States to do my master's in psychology. And we used the opportunity to actually virtually date, funny enough, by phone and Skype. And we got to have conversations, really long conversations that, we might not necessarily have had otherwise in person. So I think it's an opportunity to also get to know your partner on a different level and a deeper level. And that's just one positive spin on it.
The website
and stay patient and stay strong.
The website Refinery29 had an article this past summer about dating, what it's like to date during the pandemic. And one of the daters that they profiled had this to say: I've been single for a year. I didn't really feel ready to date again until the new year, and then COVID happened. My worst interaction, I messaged this guy for over a month. He revealed a lot. I revealed a lot. Then we talked on the phone, and it was just all wrong. Shiver. I'd waited too long to make that critical transition from text to voice, and that was Marta. Rebecca, because of public health concerns, people seem to have opted for periods of where you're texting somebody over a long period of time before actually meeting in person. Has communicating virtually made dating easier or harder?
I think it's made communicating with another person a lot easier because I find that a lot of people are more comfortable with speaking online instead of face to face. It's a lot less intimidating. But then once you get too comfortable with speaking online and eventually you meet them in person, it depends on how comfortable you are with them and how comfortable you are with face-to-face interaction. And like that snippet you read there, it could all go south if you become, I guess, too comfortable with online communication and you just rely on that.
And Marianne, from the work that you're doing, have you found any kind of trepidation from the people that have filled out the survey about maybe people not being who they are online through the text messages as opposed to in real life?
That wasn't something our survey really is able to address, but I don't think that's anything to do with the pandemic per se, right? That's always the concern with online dating. And that's something that's really special about a virtual media. Like it's not, you can't really pretend to be someone that's very, very different, at least in terms of appearance, when you meet someone in real life at the grocery store, for example. So it's definitely something to do with online dating per se. But what I will say that we do have data on is that the different dating apps are saying that about a third of participants, sometimes higher depending on the app, their membership, when they poll them, a third of them are willing to form a monogamous, exclusive relationship that's virtual only. And so they don't need to meet the person in real life. They think that they're going to get to know enough about the person that they would be willing to consider forming this exclusive monogamous relationship. And I think that's really telling about what we think we need to really have that sort of connection with somebody. And it's just, I don't know, I think it's really intriguing that, historically we've always held this idea of, well, if you have to meet someone in real life, you have to smell them, see how they move, see how they sound, all those sorts of really important things. And as a psychologist, I absolutely believe that's true. But it's interesting that we're beginning to think about boiling a relationship down into this very core element of connection. And I think the pandemic has especially brought that to light for us.
And Natasha, we've got about 20 seconds. Any advice on someone navigating the dating world during this pandemic?
Yes, treat the online dating world as respectfully and with as much integrity as you would if you were meeting in person. So show up on time, make sure your Wi-Fi connection is good. Don't be coming on and off screen. Just be respectful and be open and be available, be open, and be on time.
Thank you so much for this conversation to all three of you. It's been very insightful, and stay safe. We'll talk soon.
Thank you.
Advice for staying safe in this pandemic can be hard enough to give to adults. It's even harder with children. This week, our Ontario Hub's journalist who covers Hamilton, Niagara, Justin Chandler, wrote about a novel way, well, really, it's a storybook to help kids understand. He spoke to author, illustrator, and medical student Nicole Creamy about it. Here's their conversation.
Hi, Nicole. Thanks for coming on TVO.
Hi, Justin. Thanks so much for having me.
So let's start with what compelled you to create Patty and the Pandemic?
Well, for me, I'm a medical student. And when COVID-19 first started, I, like many other students, was sent home. And I was disappointed because I couldn't see my friends and my whole life changed. And the thing that brought me comfort was knowing why those restrictions were in place and agreeing with those reasons. And the first thing I thought of was how much more difficult this must be for the young children who don't have the same understanding that I have, because knowledge really is a privilege. And then looking at the resources that were available online, a lot of them seemed very dense and non-accessible to children, specifically in the age group of 3 to 8 years old, where they just kind of want to be having fun and see things in a more kind of light and less dense way. So it seemed like it would be a good idea to kind of fill that gap and create something fun, and then also a good initiative to do given the fact that I was now home and had a little bit more time on my hands.
Right. Well, and you had some help with this, right? Can you tell us about the people who helped you make sure that all this information was accurate?
Yeah, so thankfully, right before COVID actually happened, one of my tutors at medical school was a public health specialist. So once I finished writing the book, I sent it over to her and then she reviewed it for me and then told me what kind of public health priorities they had so that I could make sure that the information in the book was as accurate as possible. And then after she reviewed it, I also had my mentor, Dr. Peter Adamson, who is also the founder of the charity that we're donating all of the profits from this book to. He went and read over the book as well. And then we spent countless hours just going back and forth and fine tuning everything to make sure each verse rhymed as well as possible and was as fun and intriguing for kids to read as we could make it.
And you talk about trying to make something less dense and something fun for kids. What was something important that you learned about making something accessible for children?
I think that in any kind of academic field, we're constantly bombarded with a lot of information and it's really interesting and we want to share it with people. But the number one thing that I learned is that less can sometimes be more. You know, when it comes to COVID, especially, there's so many things that an individual can do to keep themselves safe or to keep the people around them safe. However, if we were to go and provide all of that information to the children, most of it probably wouldn't stick. So the number one takeaway I got was, you know, think of what our number one goal is and how we can get that one goal across as best as possible. And then once we've achieved that goal, maybe then we can consider the next steps.
Now, Premier Doug Ford gave you a shout out at a press conference last week. Let's take a look at that.
And this is what I call the true Ontario spirit. Nicole, you're an absolute champion. And along with being a medical student at McMaster, and we all know how hard they work, she's found time to put this together. But do you know what I love? Everything she makes off this is going to charity.
So how did you feel about that?
I was absolutely elated. I mean, when I first started this book, I had really just done it because I love art and I love writing and I love children. So it seemed like something that would be fun. And at the very most, I would just share it with some children in my community. And after putting all of those hours of work in, to have someone who has been basically living and breathing the pandemic and doing everything he could to help us, to have him go and acknowledge it not only to me in person in our meeting, but then also on national television for everyone else in Ontario, that just felt really amazing. And it really helped a lot too, because as a result of that interview, many people reached out to me afterwards and we've been able to sell so many more books. So I'm incredibly grateful and it was a very nice moment for sure.
Now, you're an artist, but you're also a scientist. What is it about marrying those two disciplines that you like so much?
I think that one thing that I like about it is that everyone says that they're so different, and I've always seen them as similar. And the reason why I see them as similar and why I enjoy combining them is because both of them are different ways to understand yourself and the world. So from an art perspective, by drawing, by painting, I'm learning more about myself and my perspectives and how I feel, and it's kind of a reflective process for me. But then science allows me to understand my body, why my body is working the way that it is, or why the world is working the way that it is. So combining the two of those together is something that's very powerful, not only for yourself from an introspective point of view, but also in a way of understanding the world and even being able to communicate with others.
So Nicole, you and me are in the demographic that's leading case counts right now. What would you say to young people who aren't really sure or maybe don't understand the importance of following these public health guidelines?
I think it's completely okay to not understand the importance of following the guidelines. I mean, at our age especially, we're just trying to live our lives. And it's been going on for a long time and it can definitely be difficult. So I think, first of all, it's important to not be too hard on yourself, but then also to not be afraid to have the conversations. You know, there's always opportunities to learn, and whether you agree with decisions or don't agree, having a conversation can help inform your own perspective and then as a result, inform your own decisions.
Nicole, thank you so much for coming on TVO.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me today.
The agenda this week assessed Canada's foreign policy with China, asked if the internet is in danger of becoming the splinternet, and explored how governments nudge students to consider different career paths. The agenda's week in review begins beneath the now empty office towers of the province with the hard-hit small businesses that usually serve them.
Grant, get us started here because you represent the companies and the retailers which really do truly make up this hidden office economy. When you are looking at the retailers and the hospitality industry and the service providers, just let's start with this. How important would you say they are to the overall health of the city's economy?
Very important. If you look at the path, there's 1,200 retail services and storefronts, well over 5,000 people employed. It's a very important driver. If you look at it, what's like right now, clearly the numbers are down. Many people are working from home, as you said. There are a great number of retailers that are open, and there is, clearly traffic on the path. I go down on a regular basis and spend time in the office.
Samantha, pick up the story from there. Is there any sense of what percentage of workers in the office, who are in the office rather, and how many are still working remotely?
So we estimate right now only 2 to 10% of office workers have actually returned to the office. Our team is focused on returning people to the office and reducing or mitigating the risk of the virus spread. So we've implemented a lot of strategies for clients in Toronto and across Canada to do that, which are a mix of physical interventions and behavioral protocols to make sure that people can operate within their office environment and trust that everybody is doing the best they can do to reduce that risk of spread. However, we are still seeing that reduced rate of return. So while we have produced plans that actually maximize the capacity thus far and still let people be somewhat safe, we still see that reduced rate of return. And I think one of the reasons is the reluctance to take public transportation. We know from the TTC and the study they produced in the summer that ridership was down 86%. So psychologically, I think people aren't prepared to take public transportation, and that greatly affects the downtown population.
Have you been on the subway or streetcar or bus lately?
I have not. However, my son, who's a higher risk taker than me, has taken both, and he said, "Mom, it's perfectly fine."
I was just going to say that. I'm on it all the time. I mean, I'm on the subway quite frequently, and it's perfectly fine. I mean, everybody masks up, and if you don't have one, they'll hand you one as you walk in, and it really looks like, so I guess what I'm getting at here is, the TTC, I don't think, is any longer a good enough explanation for why people aren't coming back, because the TTC seems perfectly safe. In which case, why do you think there's additional reluctance by people to come back? Because 2 to 10% of people back in those buildings is not very much.
Well, we may see it shift as the weather changes. So what I like to say is a Canadian uses any excuse to be outdoors in the summer. So we've had the summer, Canada effect on the office environment. But now that kids have returned to school and we're going to start seeing colder weather, people might slip into the office more. Also, I think that working from home was a bit of a novelty at first, but that's sort of starting to wear thin. We are seeing that people are, there is a productivity loss that's happening now that we didn't see in the summer months. And people are sort of getting wary of Zoom meetings, so they're having Zoom fatigue. So I do think we'll probably start to see an increase. Now, of course, if we're all indoors and we start to see an increase in the virus more so than we are now, then we're going to have that reversal. But let's say I'm positive that in October, November, we'll start to see a bit of an increase downtown. And then we'll see what happens, of course, if people aren't behaving and we see more of the virus spread. So, of course, that's always the big factor.
Right, gotcha. Joseph, let's tell your story here. Where do you work in the path?
I work at a salon in the Standard Life Centre. And I've worked in the TD Centre. I've worked at Richmond Adelaide Centre.
So right in the heart of the financial district.
Right in the heart of it, yes.
And when business is normal, in other words, when there's not a global pandemic affecting the path and everything else, how's business?
Business is fantastic because if you have 40 floors above you that are full of people and thousands of people walking by your door, you tend to have business. But now we're down 90% at our business.
Well, that certainly jibes with the numbers Samantha just gave us. So what, are you still going into work?
I've gone from four 10-hour days to 1 3-hour day a week.
Yikes. What's that done to your bottom line?
Well, there's no bottom line left, Steve. Like, it's just, so I'm doing hair at people's homes. I've become a traveling hairdresser is what I've become.
Do you like that?
Not really my gig, no.
I guess we're going to start with a bit of a focus on the previous government's efforts to create so-called free tuition for lower income people who wanted to go for post-secondary education. And let's just set that up with this clip from the former Deputy Premier, Deb Matthews. Shelton, if you would.
My mandate was clear from the Premier to get better value for the money we were spending. And if there were better ways, different ways of doing things, then it was our job to implement that. We decided that the way we would approach it would be to look at, we called them boulders, groups of programs that had the same goal. And one of the boulders we identified right off the bat was student financial aid. So we forced finance and TCU to actually work together to develop a student aid plan that was way simpler for students and increase participation rates amongst those with the lowest rates.
TCU, of course, being training colleges and universities, one of the ministries involved in this. Okay, Kareem, I want you to take us behind the scenes and talk to us about how difficult it is when you see all of these, as she calls them, boulders in place, how difficult it is to get numerous members of any government on the same page, agreeing to a policy and then giving it effect. How does that happen?
That happens with political leadership and with advocacy. That clip really shows the two solitudes there of two different departments that are both responsible for a program, but historically feel their own ownership of those issues. And so what the Premier did and what Minister Matthews did with the support of former student activists who ended up being in government, like Paris Szymanski and Sam Andre, who were in that documentary as well, was to say, can we do this better? Can we sacrifice some of those tax credits that are going more to higher and upper income families and redirect those at no additional cost to lower income families? And that creates the setup, a really virtuous circle where people now start to think, oh, I can access university. If I'm got this message that tuition can be free, it's not just good for if you're in grade 12, but it's good if you're in grade 6, if your family's starting to think about what the prospects of post-secondary are for later on in your life.
Kareem, in your view, was the program successful?
It was absolutely successful. I'll just quote some statistics from the first year of the program. 19% increase in awards for students from low-income families, 34% an increase in awards to Indigenous students, 31% an increase in awards to mature students. And you can find these statistics in the interactive Dive platform that you're profiling there. So it got more aid to students who needed it. It was more expensive than originally planned for, but that's in part because more people took up the program than were expected, and that was part of the policy goal.
All right, let's get some more feedback. Melissa Lansman, in your view, was the program a success?
Well, so I think there's something that comes from political leadership, but then there's also a political reality of when this program was introduced, probably at the end of a mandate of a government that had sort of lost the confidence of Ontarians on issues of affordability and was seen to be spending money for the sake of spending money. So Kareem did mention that the program was oversubscribed and it ballooned to the potential of $2.7 billion by next year if it had happened. And so I think that overall the setup for the program, the communications, the implementation for getting more students to go to school, well, that didn't happen. It redistributed who got the benefit of the taxpayer-funded tuition, rather than actually incentivizing more people to seek out post-secondary education.
Simone, you want to break the tie on this?
I think, of course, in some ways they're both right. Did it work overall? If I really had to come down on one side or the other, I would say no, it did not work in the way that we really wanted to see increased enrollment of those groups. But I think the way that it worked is around communication, and I don't think that we should underestimate that. Was it too expensive? Yes. Did it get the whole province? Did it get all of Canada talking about a discussion about what do we need to make sure that students, that the groups that Kareem mentioned, Indigenous students, mature students, what do they need, not just to get into school, but to actually stay in post-secondary?
I think there is obviously a debate taking place in government, outside of government. Like a similar debate is taking place within many of our the political systems of our allies in Europe. The attitudes towards China are changing very rapidly. But I think that the Canadian public on this both recognizes China as hostile and untrustworthy, and but does not want to cut off trade with China, doesn't want to sever economic relations, and doesn't want an escalating dispute. And so it's managing how to push back against China without risking an escalation that would end up hurting Canada more, and trying to do that working with our allies who are themselves trying to readjust their positions towards China. I think that's the bigger story about what's happening here, even in Canada.
Okay, understood. As promised now, Sherry, I'd like to get you into the conversation. Just by way of background, you're from Hong Kong. You're a pro-democracy activist from there. We should point out that earlier this year, in July, Canada suspended its extradition treaty with Hong Kong as part of a package of responses to the imposition of that new security law that China has imposed on Hong Kong. What does all of that say to you about the state of Canada's relationship with Hong Kong today?
I think Canada has taken an important step in supporting Hong Kongers, but also in standing up against the authoritarian agenda of Beijing. But realistically, the extradition treaty, while suspended, Hong Kong Canadians are still at risk. We have seen China use their diplomatic relations with other countries to extradite Canadians, and other Canadians are being arbitrarily detained in China. I want to draw the case of Hussein Jalil, who's a Uyghur Canadian who's been detained since 2007. We have other Chinese Canadians who are unnamed, detained in China and denied consular access. So I think while it's a first step, I think the lack of a strategic framework in approaching China is the flaw that Canada is dealing with right now.
Well, let me follow up on that with something that was reported in the New York Times just a few days ago, and it goes like this. Foreign governments should not benchmark what happens in Hong Kong against standards that prevail in Western countries. Those are governed by a political system entirely different from China's. Instead, they should benchmark Hong Kong against the rest of China and measure how the city can maintain its unique characteristics: openness, a commitment to personal rights and freedoms, respect for the rule of law, and the ability to reinvent itself economically. Beijing's national security law is saving, quote, one country, two systems, by ensuring that Hong Kong does not become a danger to China. And come on back in here. This piece makes it clear that China will call the shots, and there's very little that Western countries can do about it. For better or worse, is the author of that piece right?
Well, China sees this as opportunism. There's no doubt about that. But it also, I think, not just demonstrates a sense of powerlessness amongst the West, but it also demonstrates a lack of knowledge on how the West can move forward in influencing and engaging with China on these issues. We need to understand China's strategic goals much better, and the foundation, political culture, quest for economic supremacy, military and security intent, Belt and Road objectives, much, much better than we do already. China will always flex its muscles and exercise its national sovereignty in its own neighborhood. So, engaging with them needs to understand that this quest for economic supremacy really requires peace. So not military expansionism, but there is also different conceptions of the individual that China brings. Their pursuit of economic goals is based on, so it's a revolutionary economic model, one that we really have troubles identifying with. So it's all about education here and knowledge and ways of navigating through in a way that allows options to open when the irritants are removed. At the moment, we don't have a plan to hit the ground running with pace when those irritants are removed.
David, would you agree with that observation that among people in Canada who ought to be in a position to influence the agenda, there is, according to Anne, a lack of knowledge about China's aims and legitimate aspirations?
If anybody who is responsible for our foreign policy, in particular our foreign policy vis-a-vis China, has a lack of knowledge of how China operates, then I think they should maybe crack open a history book or read media reporting on China over the last 20 years. The problem in Hong Kong is that Canada and other Western countries have been feckless and irresponsible as step by step China dismantled one country, two systems. And the person who wrote that piece in the New York Times, of course, is a member of the pro-China establishment in Hong Kong. So we are complicit in this. We should have learned our lesson long, long ago.
I want to start by just setting up our conversation by reading something that was written almost a quarter century ago by the Electric Frontier Foundation's co-founder, John Perry Barlow. And this is what he called a declaration of the independence of cyberspace. Sheldon, the graphic, if you would, and let's go. Governments of the industrial world, he wrote, you weary giants of flesh and steel, I come from cyberspace, the new home of mind. On behalf of the future, I ask you of the past to leave us alone. You are not welcome among us. You have no sovereignty where we gather. We have no elected government, nor are we likely to have one. I declare the global social space we are building to be naturally independent of the tyrannies you seek to impose on us. You have no moral right to rule us, nor do you possess any methods of enforcement we have true reason to fear. Governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. You have neither solicited nor received ours. Okay, Scott, get us started here. That pretty provocative thing was written almost 25 years ago. How would you describe the vision for the internet around this time?
Well, you know, like the French Revolution, what bliss it was in that dawn to be alive. Everything looked as though the single model, as Francis Fukuyama told us, of liberal, open, democratic government and free markets was going to take over the world. And the internet was seen as kind of the, as an electronic, borderless analog of that speech would become free across borders and the power of the state would wither away. So none of that really has happened. And the powers of the state have steadily increased with respect to cyberspace and the World Wide Web. Initially in the 90s, when you started having the ability to, you know, actually participate on the web as a sort of non-geek human being, it was completely dominated by the United States. It was completely dominated by US companies. The real battles for freedom were between the geek community and the United States government, which wanted to control various forms of content like pornography and drug dealing and money laundering. But once those issues were more or less worked out in the 2000s, there seemed to be a relatively open plane of an international platform. Really, it wasn't until the Snowden revelations that governments began to push back really hard against a U.S.-dominated system. Although that had been in the cards since the mid-90s. Really, it was a gradual process of kind of the reassertion of state power up to today, when it continues to be asserted ever more.
Eileen, let me repeat one of the quotes in that Barlow piece. You have no sovereignty, he wrote 24 years ago. Have governments around the world listened to that admonition?
No, 24 years later, absolutely not. We've seen, a radical flip of John Perry Barlow's vision. But I do want to say that at the time, he really did capture something important, and I don't want to forget that. He wasn't wrong in those early days, and he was a visionary and a wonderful, genuinely libertarian spirit, and he was very influential on that early community. And he was right in the sense that at that time, the early internet was a challenge to governments for the very simple reason that, the inherent feature, global, transborder, instantaneous communication, is inherently challenging to a model of nation states defined by territorial boundaries And it was challenging to governments at the time. And there was a phase for about a decade of this sense of liberty, and that the early days were that the internet would be beneficiary to civil society actors, human rights activists around the world, and that authoritarian governments would not be able to catch up. That was mistaken, but I will say a full decade, 2011, the Freedom Online Coalition was formed, which was a coalition of governments supporting this vision of the global, open, interoperable internet for civil society. 2012 was the first UN resolution on internet freedom, proclaiming this idea that human rights must be protected online as offline. It did come to an end the next year with the Snowden revelations, where there was this sense that democratic governments themselves were not adhering to these principles. And on some level, we've almost never recovered from that moment.
That's just some of what we covered this week on The Agenda. For more, including the full conversations, you can visit our website, tvo.org, our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda. And that's it for this Friday, October 9th, 2020. Next week, we'll hear why buying locally grown food is better for everyone. Get the long view on the October crisis and catch up with artificial intelligence public opinion expert Aaron Kelly on the U.S. election and more. I'm Nam Kiwanuka. Thank you for watching TVO and for joining us online at tvo.org. Have a terrific Thanksgiving weekend, and Steve, we'll see you again on Monday.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. Ontario Hubs are made possible by the Barry and Laurie Green Family Charitable Trust and Goldie Feldman. And by viewers like you. Thank you.